The first rays of morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the third-floor hallway when the truck skidded on the sharp bend of the road. The metal screeched, chains snapped, and the rear door flew open with the force of a wound, spilling something far more terrifying than blood. Instead of liquid, it was muscle, fur, and raw fury. 400 kilos of silverback gorilla tumbled onto the hot asphalt, rising with deliberate slowness, as if the world had just turned into a stage for his performance. Rather than heading towards the distant woods, he turned his head in the opposite direction, sniffing the air with flaring nostrils, and began moving toward the small brick building ahead. The Springwood Assisted Living Center, with its perfect manicured lawns, gave off the scent of disinfectant mixed with stale vegetable soup, far from springtime cheer. Inside room 23, Mr. Rodrigo sat in the same spot he had for the past 100 days, his frail body propped up in a faded synthetic leather chair. His hands hung lifelessly over his knees, resembling branches stripped of vitality, and his gaze was locked on a place that no one else could see. Perhaps the void itself, or a forgotten memory he no longer recognized. The nurse had changed his diaper an hour ago, adjusted his pillow with robotic efficiency, and combed through his thinning grey hair with the gentleness of someone who had repeated the same motions for so long that they had become automatic without any thought or life behind them. Rodrigo didn't respond, just as he hadn't when his granddaughter brought him a birthday cake 3 months ago, singing the song by herself while tears filled her eyes. He didn't react when his son held his hand, desperately pleading for just one word, any sound to prove that there was still someone living inside the frail shell. Alzheimer's doesn't kill instantly, it's a slow drowning. The tide rises slowly, inch by inch, until it covers your mouth, your nose, your eyes. And what remains is just the feeling of being submerged underwater, unaware that once you knew how to swim. The day had begun like any other, with the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning and the stale scent of disinfectant in the hallways. Rodrigo sat motionless, his vacant stare aimed at the invisible horizon only he could see. His world had shrunk to the confines of this sterile room, where the noise of nurses' footsteps and the distant chatter of the other residents seemed muffled far away. The disease had long since stolen his memories, the names of his children, the faces of those he once loved, the adventures he had shared with the world outside. Now, all that was left was the feeling of time slipping by, too slowly to notice. Outside, a different story was unfolding. The truck that had swerved and flipped was a rare incident, one that would quickly be forgotten in the bustle of life. But for Kiko, the gorilla, it was a sign. The scent of something familiar, something from his past, called him. His massive body, once small and vulnerable, now strong and unstoppable, moved with purpose. Kiko wasn't simply walking. He was following an invisible trail, a scent locked away in the recesses of his memory, a trail that led him straight to Springwood Assisted Living Center. Rodrigo, sitting in his chair, was unaware of the approaching force. The nurse had just finished tending to him when the distant echo of the door being ripped from its hinges sent a ripple of panic through the building. In that instant, everything changed. The once still and lifeless room now vibrated with energy, as if time itself had shifted. The gorilla entered, a shadow cast across the room, standing tall and intimidating. But Rodrigo, in his fragile state, did not flinch. Something in his memory stirred, an instinct, a connection, something long buried within him. And so the scene unfolded, one that neither man nor animal could have foreseen. The room felt suffocatingly silent as Rodrigo sat in his chair, his face pale and etched with the marks of time. His hands were clasped tightly together, but they trembled slightly, the only sign that there was still some life left within his fragile body. His eyes, once bright and filled with stories of a life well lived, were now dull and vacant, fixed on nothing in particular. He had spent countless days like this, staring at nothing, existing without truly living. But today was different. Today something stirred within the air. It was subtle at first, just a shift, a flicker, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. The low hum of the old air conditioner was drowned out by a sudden, deafening crash. The door to his room was wrenched from its hinges with such force that it sounded like thunder. The walls trembled, and for the briefest moment, Rodrigo felt the earth shift beneath him. His heart raced, but his body, old and worn, didn't respond as it once would have. From the hallway, the sounds of chaos erupted, shouting voices, the clatter of falling trays, the rush of footsteps. Panic spread through the building as everyone scrambled to understand what was happening. Nurses rushed down the corridors, while some residents, startled from their slumbers, murmured in confusion. But none of that mattered to Rodrigo. His mind, consumed by the fog of Alzheimer's, clung to something else, a feeling, an ancient recognition. His heart pulsed with a sense of urgency, though he could not explain why. And then, like a shadow crossing his path, the figure appeared. Kiko, the gorilla, moved with deliberate slowness, his massive form filling the doorway. His fur, once a deep shade of black, now glowed with an intensity that seemed to radiate from within. His chest heaved with each breath, and his eyes locked onto Rodrigo, filled with a knowing that only the two of them shared. The room, once sterile and quiet, was now filled with the scent of earth, sweat, and something more, something raw and primal. Rodrigo blinked, his heart racing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, his mind seemed to clear. The fog that had clouded his thoughts lifted, if only for a moment. His hands, which had been so still and lifeless just moments before, twitched. His lips parted, and he gasped softly. His mind reached for something, a memory that seemed just out of reach. Kiko didn't move. He stood there in the doorway, his gaze unwavering, as if waiting for something. His large, intelligent eyes were filled with something akin to recognition, but it was more than that. It was an understanding that transcended words, time, and space. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no hospital, no nurses, no family. There was only Rodrigo, the old man in his chair, and the great beast before him. It was as though time had stopped, holding its breath. And then something miraculous happened. Rodrigo's lips trembled, and with a soft, ragged whisper, a name slipped from his mouth, a name he had not spoken in years. Kiko. His voice cracked, barely a sound, but it was enough. The gorilla's eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, the two creatures, one human, one animal, shared something profound. A bond that had been forged in the past, a bond that had never truly broken, no matter the years, the distance, or the disease. Kiko stepped forward, his massive hands gently reaching out toward Rodrigo. He lowered his head slowly, bringing his face closer to the old man until their foreheads touched. The room, once filled with confusion and chaos, became silent. In that silence, something extraordinary happened. A spark of recognition, a spark of humanity, reignited in the deep recesses of Rodrigo's mind. The connection was simple, a touch, a gesture, but it was enough. The air in room 23 hung thick with an unspoken tension. Outside, the clamor of sirens and hurried voices echoed through the corridors, but inside the room, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Kiko's enormous form loomed over Rodrigo, his fur soft against the brittle skin of the old man. The gentle pressure of the gorilla's forehead against Rodrigo's was the first warmth he had felt in what seemed like years, a comfort he had long since forgotten. Rodrigo's heart beat faster, a rhythm he could feel even in his fingertips, as if the connection between him and Kiko was coursing through his veins. The faint trace of recognition was more than just a flicker. It was a spark, a fire that had been lying dormant beneath layers of time and disease. His eyes, once clouded with the fog of Alzheimer's, began to clear. The chaos that surrounded him, the frantic nurses, the pounding footsteps, the distant shouting, faded into the background. All that remained was the gorilla, his gentle presence, and Rodrigo's awakening mind. For a moment, Rodrigo sat there, lost in the feeling of Kiko's touch, feeling his pulse align with the steady rhythm of the gorilla's breathing. It was like a door that had been sealed shut for years had cracked open. Memories began to flow back in fragments, blurry at first, but growing clearer as they rushed to the surface. The sharp smell of pine and damp earth, the crackling sound of firewood burning on cold nights, the sound of Kiko's voice, low and rumbling, calling out to him in a language only the two of them understood. Rodrigo tried to speak, his lips trembling, but his voice failed him. He wanted to say so much, to ask the gorilla where he had been all these years, to apologize for everything he couldn't remember. Instead, all he managed was a weak smile, one that spoke of gratitude and something more, something deeper. Outside the room, the sound of footsteps grew louder. A team of police officers and paramedics had arrived, their guns trained on the door, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of danger. But none of them had bargained for what they were witnessing. None of them could have prepared for the scene unfolding inside the room. An old man, frail and lost in the haze of Alzheimer's, sitting in a chair with his hand gently resting on the arm of a gorilla. The gorilla raised his head slowly, his eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. His massive chest expanded with each breath, but his demeanor was calm, unthreatening. Kiko had not come to cause harm. He had come to reconnect, to bring something back that had been lost. Rodrigo blinked again, and for a moment the world shifted. He wasn't sitting in a sterile hospital room anymore. He was in the forest, the sun filtering through the canopy above, surrounded by trees he had protected for years. And there, beside him, was Kiko, a young gorilla in his arms, trembling and frightened, but safe. "Kiko," Rodrigo whispered, the name flowing out of him like a stream breaking free from a dam. Kiko's eyes softened further, and he let out a low, comforting sound. A sound that wasn't a growl or a roar, but something between a hum and a purr, like a gentle reassurance. It was as though the gorilla understood the importance of this moment more than anyone else in the room. The human and animal had shared a bond for decades, one that no amount of time or illness could erase. But outside, the tension was rising. The officers had received their orders. The situation was quickly escalating, and they were preparing to act. But something about Kiko's presence in that room, the peacefulness that radiated from him, made them hesitate. It was as if they, too, could sense the deep connection between the two beings in front of them, something that no gun or tranquilizer could sever. The nurses stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. One of them, an older woman who had known Rodrigo since his first days at Springwood, began to cry softly. She had never seen him speak since the onset of his illness, and now, here he was, speaking the name of an animal he had saved years ago. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. The officers stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed, while paramedics huddled together, watching through the small window in the door. They had trained for emergencies, for crisis situations involving injured humans and dangerous animals. But this was something entirely different. A gorilla, calm and collected, standing face to face with a man who, until moments ago, had been lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. The air was thick with uncertainty, yet inside that room, something miraculous was unfolding, something that couldn't be explained by logic or science. Rodrigo's hand rested lightly on Kiko's arm, the sensation of the gorilla's fur soft beneath his fingertips. His fingers twitched slightly as he traced the contours of the beast's muscle, his eyes fixed on Kiko's face. The bond between them was undeniable, and for the first time in years, Rodrigo felt as if he was seeing clearly again. The fog in his mind had lifted, even if just for a few moments, and he could feel memories rushing back. Memories of a time when he had been strong, when he had cared for this creature as a young, vulnerable gorilla. Kiko's eyes met Rodrigo's with an almost human-like understanding. He stood there, still waiting for the man to say more, to offer more words. But Rodrigo, too overwhelmed with emotion, could only stare, a tear slipping down his wrinkled cheek. There was no need for more words between them. They had shared this moment before, years ago, in the forests of their youth. The air in the room shifted as the door creaked open slightly. A voice called out from the hallway, but it wasn't the sound of police or emergency personnel. It was the voice of a familiar family member. Rodrigo's son Daniel had arrived. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was soft, tentative, yet filled with hope. He stepped into the room slowly, his eyes immediately landing on his father, sitting in his wheelchair with a gorilla standing before him. He froze for a moment, disbelief washing over him. He had heard the reports, had even spoken to the authorities, but seeing it in person was something entirely different. His eyes shifted from Rodrigo to Kiko. The scene in front of him felt like something out of a dream, something that couldn't possibly be real. But it was. There in the silence of that small room, the connection between man and animal was unmistakable. Rodrigo, his voice hoarse but steady, spoke again. "Kiko," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of recognition and sorrow. The word came out softer this time, like a prayer, like a confession he had been holding inside for far too long. Daniel's heart raced, but he held himself together. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes moving back and forth between his father and the gorilla. He didn't understand. How could he? But something inside him, something deep within, told him that this moment, this reunion, was more important than anything else in the world. Kiko remained still, his massive frame unwavering, his gaze softening as if to acknowledge the presence of a new face. There was a quiet power in the air, something profound that seemed to resonate through the room. Daniel reached out, his hand trembling slightly, as if unsure of the right thing to do. His fingers brushed the back of Kiko's arm, and for the briefest of moments the gorilla turned his head and met his gaze. It was as if Kiko understood the complexity of the moment, the reunion of family, the weight of the past, and the beauty of memory. "Dad," Daniel said again, his voice cracking as he knelt down beside Rodrigo. I don't know what this is, but I'm so glad you're back. You're here. You're really here." Rodrigo looked at his son, his expression softening as he placed his trembling hand on his son's shoulder. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this connection, this love. His mind had forgotten, but his heart hadn't. And now, with Kiko by his side, he could feel that love rushing back in full force. Kiko, sensing the weight of the moment, lowered his massive head to rest once again against Rodrigo's. The bond was undeniable, stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than the ravages of Alzheimer's. And in that moment, surrounded by his family, Rodrigo was no longer lost to the fog of disease. He was home. He was whole. Outside the room, the officers stood in stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. All they could do was watch as the unspoken miracle unfolded before them. As the sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow over the room, Rodrigo whispered one final time, his voice full of quiet strength, "Kiko, you found me." And in that moment, the world outside faded away. All that mattered was the bond between a man and a gorilla, two souls who had found each other after years of separation. When the door closed behind the officers and the doctors, the room returned to its silence. The chaos that had erupted just moments ago now felt distant, almost unreal. Yet inside it was as though time had folded back on itself. A miracle had occurred, not of science, but of connection, the kind that transcends words, diagnoses, and time itself. Rodrigo may not have remembered everything, but in the presence of Kiko, he remembered what truly mattered, and that was enough.